Okay, hello and good afternoon. We are so excited for today's Coffee and Conversations Miami Book Fair edition. My name is really quick. We're going to do some introductions before jumping into the interview. My name is Enrique Rosell. I'm the program manager at the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab at Florida International University. And I'm so proud to welcome to you today, season 5 of our Coffee and Conversations Miami Book Fair edition. Today, we're going to learn about author Dara Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews, Reports from a Haunted Present, which Rebecca and I have been speaking about the last few days, and we're so excited to hear this conversation. A little bit about the series. The series began at this point over a year and a half ago, in the middle of the pandemic, when pivot was everyone's favorite word. We started Coffee and Conversations as a way of strengthening community ties and supporting the great work being done at our many community partners. We've explored topics from how the pandemic has affected museums and cultural institutions, the histories of anti-Blackness in museum spaces and beyond, and chatted with community partners. Visit our YouTube channel to watch all of our past episodes of Coffee and Conversations from this season and other seasons. You can just look up Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab on YouTube, or you can click the link on our Instagram, Twitter, and all of that good stuff. Now, with this season, we're working with the Miami Book Fair, which we're so excited about, to highlight a number of books from book fair authors to provide a kind of a teaser for the fair itself, which is happening very, very soon. Today, like I mentioned, we're talking with Dara Horn about her new book, People Love Dead Jews, and moderated by WPHL director Rebecca Friedman. A little bit more about the format of today's session. Our format is simple and lasts about 30 minutes. At the very end, we're going to take questions from the audience, so please submit any questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So without wasting any more time, let's go ahead and introduce our author and moderator today. So starting off with our moderator, Rebecca Friedman. Rebecca Friedman is the founding director of the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab and associate professor of history at Florida International University, and did her PhD at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. She's an expert in the cultural and gender history of modern Russia and the Soviet Union, and is the author of the first English language monograph on Russian masculinity. Her recent book, Modernity, Domesticity, and Temporality, Time at Home, explores modern time and home in the 20th century Russia. Much of her work at present involves public humanities and community engagement, especially highlighting the cultural and intellectual spirit of the greater Miami region. She's also the best boss in the world. I will add that.
Wow.
And last but not least, we have the incredible Dara Horn. A little bit about Dara. Dara is the award-winning author of 6 books, including the novel In the Image, The World to Come, All Other Nights, A Guide for the Perplexed, and Eternal Life. And the essay, of course, the one that we're going to be speaking about today, the essay collection, People Love Dead Jews, Reports from a Haunted Present. Dara is one of the Granite Magazine's best young American novelists. She is a recipient of 2 National Jewish Book Awards, the Edwards Lewis Wallant Award, the Harold U. Riballo Award, and the Reform Judaism Fiction Prize. And she was the finalist for the Wingate Prize, the Simpson Family Literary Prize, and the Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction. Her books have been selected as New York Times Notable Books, Booklist's 25 Best Books of the Decade, and San Francisco Chronicle's Best Books of the Year, and have been translated into 11 languages. Her nonfiction work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Smithsonian Magazine, and the Jewish Review of Books, among many other publications. And she's a regular columnist for Tablet Magazine. Horn received her doctorate in comparative literature from Harvard University, studying Yiddish and Hebrew. She was taught courses in these subjects at Sarah Lawrence College and Yeshiva University, and held her Gerald Weinstock Visiting Professorship in Jewish Studies at Harvard. She has lectured for audiences in hundreds of venues throughout North America, Israel, and Australia. She lives in New Jersey with her husband and 4 children. Dara's new book, People Love Dead Jews, is featured in Miami Book Fair 2021, and we're so excited to speak with her today. So without further ado, I'll pass it on over to Rebecca to start the conversation. And like we said before, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, please feel free to put them in the Q&A chat, and we'll get to them at the end of this session. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Enrique. I'm so excited to be here talking with Dara today. That was just a slightly intimidating biography, but we're going to put that to the side and go on with the conversation. Amazing, amazing. I really love this book, and it is entirely true that Enrique and I have been talking about it. So I'm excited to get started. And needless to say, it kind of forced me, as I'm sure it did for many of your readers, maybe particularly Jewish, American Jewish readers, but maybe everyone, to kind of meditate on their own life and their own attitudes and their own kind of sense of self when it comes to Jewish identity. So thank you for that opportunity. All right, I'm going to jump right in and actually ask you to start, or ask us to start with your, I think it is the very first essay, the very first chapter about Anne Frank, because obviously that will be something very familiar to all of our readers who may or may not have had the chance yet to read your book. So I wonder if you would just kind of outline for us what your argument is in that section of your book, and how and why I think you argue that the Anne Frank story is so digestible in the way in which it is presented to audiences, and maybe particularly American Jewish audiences, or maybe not, maybe global audiences. And you can tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So yes, well, I just want to say first, thank you so much for having me. It's really a delight to be here with you and everybody else involved, the Miami Book Fair and all of the other people listed on this on the last slide. So thank you so much for making this possible. Yeah, the book starts with, or at least the first chapter of the book is an essay I wrote about Anne Frank. And this really was sort of what set me down the path of writing this book, because what happened was in 2018, I was asked by Smithsonian Magazine to write a piece for them about Anne Frank. And I got that request and I felt this overwhelming dread, because I thought, wow, I really don't want to write an essay about Anne Frank. The logical thing, of course, would be to turn this assignment down. But, you know, I'm a writer, so I don't do logical things. So, and also as a writer, I sort of, I'm like, you know, I'm aware that the uncomfortable moments are where the story is, right? That's really where you know that there's really something to unpack, is when you feel that uncomfortable experience. So I was like, why don't I want to write this? And I remembered at that point a news story that I had seen about something that had happened at the Anne Frank Museum in Amsterdam. So this is a museum that is where Anne Frank, this young teenage diarist who was murdered by the Nazis, she and her family and other people were hiding in this hidden rooms in this office building. This office building where she and her family were hiding is now this blockbuster museum. They get about 2 million visitors a year. The news item I had read was about a young Jewish man who worked at this museum in 2018, and the museum would not allow him to wear his yarmulke to work. That's this little skull cap that religious Jewish men wear. They wouldn't allow him to wear his yarmulke to work. They made him hide it under a baseball hat. And he appealed this decision to the board of the museum, which deliberated for 4 months, and then relented and allowed this man to wear his yarmulke to work. And I had read this news story and I thought, 4 months is a really long time for the Anne Frank Museum to ponder whether or not it was a good idea to force a Jew into hiding. And then I was just looking this story up because I was like, yeah, I remember hearing this. And then in the process of looking it up, I found another news item from a few months earlier in 2017 at the same museum, where visitors had noticed something weird about the audio guides. It's a big international museum. They've got 10 or 15 languages for audio guides. And they have that display where it's like English and there's like a British flag, and then Francais and there's a French flag, until you get to Hebrew. Hebrew, no flag. And I thought, these are PR mishaps, but they are not mistakes. And then, so I did end up writing this piece for Smithsonian. And what I really was noticing in this is that there was this requirement that living Jews erase their own identities in order to participate in this public conversation. And so my piece for Smithsonian, which is now the first chapter of the book, starts with this line: people love dead Jews, living Jews, not so much. And, I really was sort of interested in what is it that the way that Jews were being used as like this metaphor for, the limits of civilization or something. And that was done at the expense of living Jews, and that it was done at the expense of Jewish culture. And I just was really, and to sort of a little deeper into that, I thought more about the way, not just sort of like the PR mishaps of this museum, but the way that Anne Frank's memory is abused. The most succinct example of this is the most famous line in Anne Frank's diary is probably this line where she says, "I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart." Right? That's the line that's like plastered on the wall of the museum. It's like on the cover of your book jacket. And, the reason people find this line, people like this, because it's like, oh, it's inspiring. by which we mean it flatters us, right? Like it makes us feel forgiven for those lapses in our civilization that lead to piles of murdered girls. Like, oh, a murdered girl has offered us grace, right? I mean, this is also, there's also some, I think, Christian theology in that use as well. It's like, look, this tortured, murdered Jew has offered us absolution from sin. The problem is that the reality is so much simpler. Anne Frank wrote this line about people being truly good at heart 3 weeks before she met people who weren't. Because 3 weeks after she wrote that line, she's arrested, deported to Auschwitz, and guess what? She met people there who weren't truly good at heart. But the problem is, like, you have to dump that whole reality, in the background in order to tell this like uplifting story about the wonders of humanity. And that's what I mean by this sort of erasure that's taking place in the abuse of this memory.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. I think that's a really important kind of inroads to what your entire book does. So I was, and it's also such a familiar story to each of us that your reading of it, I imagine, has caused some controversy. I wonder, so that's the next question I want to ask you about. Yes. It's not so much only that story, but the book as a whole, the title, the whole kind of perspective that you provide on the way in which kind of American society, I mean, again, I want you to maybe talk a little bit if your audience is, if the critique that is implicit in the book is intended for American audiences in particular or beyond. And also if you would talk with us a little bit about how it's been received, if you were surprised at critique, all of that, because it's such, I mean, I loved it so much because it really made me think about every assumption in this realm.
Yes, well, so right, there's a lot of things that I'm challenging in this book that people don't often challenge. And because it's not a book about like the way we usually would think about anti-Semitism, right? That it's like, oh, there's some neo-Nazi person here who's like, it's not about that at all. That's not what this book is about. This book is about the way that people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves. And that is sort of the repeating theme throughout the book. And so one of the things, for example, that I challenge in this book repeatedly is the premise that Holocaust education prevents anti-Semitism. Right. That's something that I'm challenging repeatedly. That's something that, because the reality, and we see this all the time in public life, where every time there's some public figure who, makes some vaguely anti-Semitic comment, like somebody like drags them to a Holocaust museum. Right. And the thing is that is like very cost-free for that person, because, it doesn't take a lot to say like, yeah, Nazis were bad, right? I mean, that's when I say people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves. As grim as it is to like go to a Holocaust museum, it makes you feel great about yourself because like we all look great compared to Nazis, right? Like, I mean, it's a very self-flattering thing. And especially for Americans, like where this is like, oh, this wasn't even our country. I mean, there's like, this is a very self-flattering process. And it also, again, erases living Jews. It makes it so you don't have to engage at all with the content of Jewish culture. So that's like one thing that I'm challenging. I'm also really challenging the question of what do we mean when we talk about diversity in this country? Yeah. Because, there's parts of this book where I talk about, and maybe, I don't know if we'll have time to get to this, but like I talk about anti-Semitic attacks in America today, and I talk about some of the anti-Semitic attacks that happened just before the pandemic that were against the Hasidic community. Yeah. And I looked at reports in the press about those and saw how it was just like, you couldn't even find a news article about one of those attacks that didn't say something derogatory about the community being attacked in the process of reporting the article. And that I found very remarkable. Mm-hmm. I feel that we pay lip service to diversity in order to make people conform. Right. And what I mean by that is that like, we have this idea that like, and it's part of, and it's a very well-intentioned, there's this way that we teach people about anti-bigotry education, where we say like, oh, this group that's whatever fill in the blank group that you are bigoted against, you shouldn't hate those people because they're just like everyone else. They're just like me and you. Like, that's the way we teach people. But if you think about that, that requires whoever those people are to erase what makes them distinct, right? Because, and it's particularly ironic in the case of Jewish history, because Jews spent 3,000 years not being like everybody else. right? I mean, that's sort of like almost, uncoolness is kind of Judaism's brand, going back to, 3,000 years ago, worshiping a bossy, unsexy, invisible God, like before that was cool, right? So, I mean, this is like, Jews were never cool. And, this idea that, and that's why I say we pay lip service to diversity in order to make people conform. So these are some of my contentions in this book, which are very provocative. And I put it right out there. I mean, I called my book "People Love Dead Jews," because, as I said, the uncomfortable moments are where the story is. If you think that this book the title is uncomfortable, you're going to be even more uncomfortable when you read the rest of the book, right? I mean, and that is absolutely my intention. And so, as to how the book has been received, I actually have been pleasantly surprised in some ways. Like, I expected a lot more trolling than I've received. So that's been actually, kind of nice that, nobody's doxing me or whatever, which, was something that, when you write a book called People Love Dead Jews, it's sort of, you sort of are almost asking for that. But, one thing that's actually been kind of, well, let's put it this way. So I've gotten a tremendous reader response, which has been very gratifying to me as a writer. I get a lot of responses that have a lot of responses from non-Jewish readers. And what's interesting to me about those is that most of those responses are one of two kinds. One is either, oh my God, I had no idea, right? Like, this has opened my eyes. I had absolutely no idea. Right, like that this, right. I mean, that's sort of like the number one response I get from non-Jewish readers. And then the other one I get from a lot of non-Jewish readers who maybe are members of other minorities is, this is extremely relatable. Right, because this whole, I mean, I was just on a podcast a couple of weeks ago for that was like, it's a podcast that's like about the Black community, and I remember like the interviewer was like, this is like so familiar, right? I mean, it's like, yay, Martin Luther King, yay, Martin Luther King, and then it's like, if we go past Martin Luther King, like nobody wants to hear about it, right? So it's a very familiar kind of thing for a lot. Also I've had a lot of readers talk to me about like, this is so familiar from the Native American experience. Right, of like, oh look, like we celebrate Native American culture and don't talk about how we committed a genocide. I mean, there's a lot of things like that. There are a lot of resonances in this book, because it's really a book about human dignity, and how we respect difference in a pluralistic society. That's really what the book is about. But I will tell you that I also got an enormous amount of responses from Jewish readers. And the responses from Jewish readers are remarkable to me because they're incredibly diverse. They're people American and many people from many other countries, old people, young people, religious, secular, like, and what they're all saying is they're all like sending me the exact same message, which is, I read this book, I have felt uncomfortable my entire life about these things. I never knew how to articulate it. Someone finally said it. Thank you for saying this. I'm so glad someone finally said this. I have felt uncomfortable my whole life. And to me, it's like, this is my 6th book. Like, it's always nice to get readers who appreciate your work, but like with this book, I kind of wish people liked it a little less, because because like, what it reveals is like, that I've uncovered a real problem here. Like, in other words, like, it's not just in my head. This problem is much bigger than even I thought it was.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
Like, I had not appreciated like how many people are erasing themselves in this way and didn't even appreciate that was what they were even doing.
Right.
It's very sad.
Right. I mean, you're really exposing that, not like you suggested, not just for Jews, which was something, of course, in the back of my mind as I was reading it. Let me ask you something about which wasn't even on my list of a bazillion questions, but as listening to your response, that kind of resonates with this idea of the erasure of indigenous cultures. Okay.
For sure.
So in the year 1995, I was in Krakow, Poland, working this is very relevant, working as an intern for a Center for Jewish Culture in Kazimierz, so in the very center of the heart of Jewish Krakow, not far from Auschwitz, as a PS. And long story short, at that moment, it was very cool to be Jewish. Okay, I don't know how much, I bet
I know a lot about this.
Of course you do. Of course you do. And I'm dying to hear your take.
Yes.
So it was super cool to be Jewish. And there were like 2 cafes called Cafe Ariel. You remember this?
As I said, people love dead Jews. I mean, this is
exactly like, it was stunning, but especially in the context of kind of reimagining a Polish democracy and the need for a diverse past. and anthropologists and so forth who were recognizing this as something we're studying were making comparisons with kind of indigenous cultures in the US and the ways in which indigenous cultures are romanticized and people want to have a little teeny bit in them, but not a lot, and so forth and so on. You know, Hebrew schools were filling up in Poland at that time. Everyone was discovering their Judaism.
Yeah.
What do you think? How does that fit in?
It's very, very familiar. It's, you know, and you know, your experience is 25 years ago, but it's still happening.
Mhm.
You know, and so look, I want to be really clear, like, you know, there are people in, you know, so let's put it this way. I have a whole section in my book about what I call Jewish heritage sites.
Yes.
Which is, so we talked before about, is this America, is this overseas? It's everywhere, but like, it's pervasive all over the world. And what you see is, and the reality is, there are places all over the world that had Jewish communities for thousands of years and now don't.
Right.
I mean, you know, Poland, obvious, but like, how about Libya? You know, Tripoli, the capital of Libya, was 25% Jewish in 1941. You know how many Jews live in Libya today?
Right.
Zero. They did not leave voluntarily. And by the way, all their assets were seized. Okay, so like, this is like, there's dozens of countries around the world for which this is true. And in all of those countries, it's the dynamic you're describing. As I said, people love dead Jews. So, you know, and it's just varying levels of cynicism. So to be clear, there are places where, and actually Poland's actually a better example because it's so pervasive. Like there are some like really well done, like Jewish heritage sites. There are like, you know, some like there's a Jewish museum in Warsaw that like really goes into real depth about the history of Jews in Poland. It's not just about like, here's how the Jews were killed. It's about the content of the culture. There are better and worse ways to do this. I'm not in any way saying like, you know, people should just let these historical sites go to seed or something. That's not what I'm saying at all. But, you know, there's a whole lot of cynicism going on. And so one of the chapters in my book is about a city called Harbin in China. And this is so this is a city which was it's in northeastern China. It's south of Siberia, north of North Korea. This city was basically built by Jews, and what I mean by that is the Russians in 1896 got a concession from the Chinese to build like a branch line of the Trans-Siberian Railroad into China. They needed to build like an administrative center in this. They needed to build a town in this Manchuria. They needed like Russian speaking entrepreneurs to build this town for them. But like the problem is like, who wants to move to Manchuria? The Tsarist regime came up with this genius idea, like, hello, Jews, would you like to live without anti-Semitic restrictions, but, you know, not be a bottom feeder in a New York City sweatshop? Great option for you. You can move to Manchuria. 20,000 Russian Jews built this city in Manchuria. So, you know, long story short, successive regimes all made the lives of these people more and more impossible until the last Jewish family was evacuated by the Israeli government in 1962, of course, with all their assets seized. Today, there is one Jew in the city of Harbin, and they have invested $30 million in restoring Jewish heritage sites in Harbin. And the difference with Harbin versus some other places is that they say the quiet part out loud. They had a conference about International Forum for Economic Cooperation between Harbin and the world's Jews. Did you catch the word economic and international there? And there's, you know, and then the mayor of Harbin gives a speech about, you know, all the wonderful Jews in history, like J.P. Morgan and Nelson Rockefeller. Neither of those people were Jewish. And, you know, talks about how the world's money is in the pockets of the Jews. And this shows the Jews' wisdom. Totally straight face. And then is like, you know, and like, basically he's like, you know, we've heard Jews have money. We would like some. Come and be tourists and investors in Harbin.
Right.
And it's just, it's like this it's just a ridiculously cynical enterprise. And you see that, I mean, in Egypt right now, I don't even write about it in the book. In Egypt right now, there are, the government is pouring also millions of dollars into restoring the synagogues in Cairo and Alexandria. Nasser, the Egyptian dictator in the 1950s, expelled the entire Jewish community and seized all their assets. That was a community that predated Islam. It was 2,000 years old. They were all expelled. Their assets were all seized. Now, the government is pouring money into these synagogues to restore Jewish heritage sites. Why are they doing it? To get support from UNESCO. For look how diverse we are, look how much we support. It's like, you know, these countries weren't so fond of the Jews while they lived there, but now that they're gone, like, you know, hooray. Right. And that's sort of this like ridiculous, and that's why when I say that, you know, people tell a story about dead Jews that make them feel good about themselves, that story involves completely erasing living Jewish culture. And it's, and it's also this sort of, it's just a self-serving enterprise that also erases even the violence that these communities did to the Jews when they lived there. I mean, there's a reason these countries don't have Jews anymore, and it's not because the Jews voluntarily chose to leave.
So I thank you. I'm gonna just push back a little bit here, and I'm gonna go back to the Polish example to do so.
Sure.
It's what I know the best.
Of course.
So in the case of Poland, whether it's today or in the 90s, I completely agree with the kind of cynical interpretation that, the need for cash flow to some degree, the need for communities to feel kind of better about themselves in the present moment, despite the incredibly violent past and the way in which they and their families might be implicated in that violence. I understand all of that, right, as a kind of feel good, if you will, or way of dealing with past trauma. I also, though, am not entirely cynical, which is to say, I think at least in the case of Poland.
No, and I think Poland is, as I said, is way better, because also there is a Jewish community in Poland.
There is a Jewish community.
Very small, right?
Right. But the people who are discovering their Jewish roots and are like growing payas and learning Hebrew and sending their children to, Jewish summer camps and all of that, which is a phenomenon, right? And then the number of Jews is counted and it's growing and so forth and so on. Like, yes, it's a total romanticization of the past, as with Native American and indigenous cultures in this country and elsewhere. It's also, though, in a way, there's something about it, I can't help it, maybe I'm just so naive, but there's a kind of like romantic embrace of it, or a respect, or a something like, in fact, being Jewish in Poland is cool. It is cool, like it's not in the US, or not in the ways in which you describe in your book.
Yes. Well, I mean, this is the thing, is like, right, I mean, like I said, I do think there's like a spectrum of better and worse ways to do this.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, but as you say, like this idea that it's cool is also sort of,
I know, problematic.
I mean, it's sort of, I mean, like, look, if somebody wants to go and like learn Hebrew and like, that is like a full investment in living Jewish culture.
Right.
Right. I mean, that is like, as I've written about this, I wish that were the norm.
Right.
Right. I mean, if that's like what people in a lot of these places were doing, that's great, but that's generally not what's happening.
No,
in a lot of these places. That's sort of, and that's what disturbs me. And so, to bring this back to like, there's so many sort of examples of this, and also in the US about the way we think about, the way we think about Jewish culture and sort of like what's acceptable, what's not acceptable to express in Jewish culture. There's, I think that, these other countries like that have such, almost no Jewish population, it just becomes this blank slate for people's projections. But what I think is interesting is how much that also happens in the United States, which is a place that has, does have a Jewish community, and what counts as a large Jewish community, which means that, we're like 1% of the United States population.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, thank you for that. When you write in there's so much, like we're almost done, we're almost out of time, and I like literally we're just scratched the surface.
Yes.
But when you write about the kind of ways in which Jews are somehow not cool, like so deeply relatable, I'm sure everybody said that in their reaction, but you kind of put it in a way that I understood like for the first time. But I always imagine, because I grew up in a very secular household with not much identification, not really any Jewish community actually at all, a kind of rejection of religion, my parents at the time. But so I always imagined if you were part of a Jewish community, you were cool because you had other people around you in that community. So that made you cool because you were collectively cool. So it was so interesting to me to read.
So let me break this down for you. So I can break this down a little bit, but what I'm going to make is not the argument like it's Judaism is a counterculture that runs through the entire history of the West.
Yes.
Right. That to me is what's sort of amazing and remarkable. I mean, about Jewish culture is that, what's remarkable about Jewish culture is not that it's this like litany of persecution for thousands of years.
Right.
What's remarkable is that it's a litany of resilience for thousands of years, because there are all these situations where like generally like when you had a conquest of like a dominant culture, that the other, the non-dominant culture just assimilate into it and disappear. Like that's much more typical. Whereas what's happened, in Jewish culture, there has been such a conscious effort to preserve the content of this tradition from generation to generation, and also to transform it as needed. That is sort of the amazing story of Jewish history that I think really everybody could learn a lot from, but that's what's sort of been erased by this oh, Jews are just like everyone else. I'll give sort of one example of this that's not in my book. One of the most remarkable things about Jewish culture in the past 150 years is the revival of Hebrew. Right? So this was a dead language that was brought back to life and now is the native language of millions of people. Yeah. This has never happened to any other language in the history of the world. So I mentioned I'm an academic as well as a writer. In my field is in Yiddish and Hebrew literature. It was about 5 years ago, I was speaking at a Hebrew literature conference. It was a Hebrew literature and linguistics conference, academic thing. Most of the people there are, they're Hebrew scholars, most of whom are, Jews. What was interesting though, is the people at the conference, there were some people at this conference who are from the Wampanoag Nation, which is a Native American nation in Massachusetts. And they were at this conference because they said, we want to know how you did it.
Wow.
Because they were trying to revive the language of Wampanoag, which hadn't been a spoken language in, they're like, we're only 200 years that we haven't been a spoken language. You had 2,000 years where it wasn't a spoken language and you managed to revive it. How did you do this?
Amazing.
I mean, this is a really remarkable, and there's so many things that I think we learn in, if you think about and this is the problem, people, when I say people love dead Jews, that's an easier story to tell, right? Because, if you think about what kids learn in a social studies textbook about Jews in middle school or high school, there's probably, maybe there's a page about the Israelites at the beginning. And, we don't even mention that those people are Jews. They might as well be Phoenicians. They're dead a long time ago. Right. And then if it's a textbook that has modern history in it, there's probably a chapter toward the end about the Holocaust. So from that, we learn that Jews are dead people and their murders teach us something about, this, they're a big metaphor for the limits of civilization. But imagine if you taught that this idea that this amazing thing that you have this group that is this, first of all, foundational to Western civilization, because you don't have Christianity or Islam without Judaism, right? So this is not some small group that's this is central and foundational to the Western world, but also that this is a group that doesn't conform. Right. And so when I say they're uncool, it's not about whether you personally find it appealing or not. It's that this is a group that never conforms. Right. Does not fit into a box. Right. And we see that even today in the United States, where there's whole sort of stupid debate of are Jews white? Or something like that. Where do Jews fit into a racial, it's Jews don't fit into this racial conversation. Same problem that Napoleon had when, 200 years ago, Napoleon convened the Sanhedrin, which was this ancient Jewish rabbinic court, because he wanted, if Jews are going to be citizens of the Republic, then, we have to make sure that they fit as citizens of the Republic. We have to have them just be a religion. We can't have them be a separate community. It's because Jews didn't fit into this box. Right. That's the problem. It's Jews are not conforming to the box. That makes people really mad who are making the box. Right. Absolutely. So because it challenges who they are. Right. That's the problem. That's super simple example of something we could include in that social studies textbook for those, several thousand years in between the Israelites and the Holocaust. Right. Think about something you learned in school about how mass literacy works. One thing you learn is until the printing press was invented, nobody was able to read. Only the royalty and the clergy and the nobles could read. But then, hooray, printing press, hooray, industrial production. Finally, poor people can read. Yay! The problem with that story is that it's a lie. Right. Because Jews had at least universal male literacy. Right. At least 1,000 years before the printing press. Right. That's so, poor Jewish kids in rural Yemen in the 12th century knew how to read. It turns out you don't need advanced technology or wealth in order to have people read. You just have to think reading is important. You have community. Well, that's a problem. Nobody wants to put that in the textbook, because then they'd have to admit that actually the reason nobody knew how to read for all those centuries is because people didn't think reading was important. That's not a good look, right? So that's the problem. It's but imagine if you it would really turn the way we think about history and culture on its head. Right. Jewish culture is this challenge. It's this ongoing challenge. It's a counterculture. And I think that there's a lot to learn from that in a pluralistic society.
Oh my gosh, I could talk to you forever, Dara. Thank you.
Only my children felt this way about me, but yeah, not so much. Right.
No, seriously. It's been such a pleasure. I do want to keep talking to you, but I have to mind the time. So I look forward to seeing you're coming for the book fair. I should know that. Or are you online for the book fair?
It's online. It's online.
Okay, well,
Yeah,
I look forward
unfortunately, I had to make
watching
a decision about this, like,
Yeah.
3 months ago when it was the height of Delta. So unfortunately, that was,
especially in Miami.
yeah.
We totally understand.
Yeah.
Well, I look forward to following what happens with you next. I'm curious what that will be after this splash of a book, which is truly amazing, and I've recommended to everybody. So
Yeah,
thank
well, one
you.
thing I will mention is, so in terms of what I'm working on next is that I do have this podcast, Adventures with Dead Jews,
Yes.
which tells
Yes.
totally different stories from the ones in the book, because the world's love of dead Jews is far too vast for one book to contain. So yeah, Adventures with Dead Jews is also a project I have. It's the podcast.
Yes, we were talking about that before we started. Please go check that out if you're listening. Adventures with Dead Jews, wherever you listen to podcasts, check that out. If you want to continue this conversation, we do have one question in the Q&A chat. If we want to take it, I think we should. So if you want to stay on, it's from Oren, one of our Miami Studies fellows. We love Oren. So Oren asks, "I'm so thrilled to hear Dr. Horn speak. I read what must have been your first book, A March of the Living Diary, published by the Miami Jewish Federation, for my doctoral
dissertation. A long time ago.
He's a scholar of Holocaust studies, in the
Yes.
religious studies department.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
There is a definite fascination with and even fetish. Oh my God, I can't speak. Fetishization of Jewish culture in Krakow today. Klezmer music, for example. But I'm not sure if it intersects with the actual resurgence of living Jewish culture. I am wondering if you could say more about people not only loving dead Jews, but hating Jews who are still alive. How much is anti-Semitism helping fuel the love?
It's a really interesting question. So points to you that was something I published when I was a teenager after going on this this trip to Jewish historical sites, as we say, was a trip to death camps in Poland. So and I do reflect on that in the book. So you will see, like, 30 years later what I think about that in my book. So to speak to that, but so in terms of, like, there's this, I think it's sort of undeniable at this point, this upsurge in anti-Semitism in the United States and around the world. What I think is really interesting is, I think there was a whole generation where you had this concept in the American Jewish community that Holocaust education would prevent anti-Semitism, right? And I think you saw that starting about, actually at the time when I wrote that piece, was in the 1990s when you had the opening of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. There were sort of a lot of other memorials that were going on at that time. There was, like, the movie Schindler's List, a lot of those sort of things were coming out. And I think that, those things, like, when you went to these movies or went to these museums at that time, like, obviously these things were really grim, but, like, there was a kind of optimism to them, right? Because there was this idea that people would, go to this museum or read this book or go to this movie, and they would learn what the world had done to the Jews and learn where hatred could lead, and they would then, stop hating Jews, right? And 30 years later, I sort of, wonder, I think that, it wasn't a ridiculous idea, but, like, I think maybe it's time to reevaluate it, because what I think is really interesting now is, when you see this surge of anti-Semitism, like, if, like, people are, like, if anti-Semites are, like, trolling Jews online by, like, photoshopping them into gas chambers, the problem is not that those people don't know about the Holocaust. Those people know about the Holocaust, right? I mean, that, you see this now at the trial in Charlottesville, like, I mean, all this, like, neo-Nazi image, like, the problem is not that these people don't know about the Holocaust. And that's sort of, what's interesting to me about this is, there was this idea that this would prevent anti-Semitism. And I think that part of it is that because it had to come with this erasure of Jewish culture. I don't know that it ever would have succeeded. I mean, one thing that's interesting about anti-Semitism too is that it's cyclical. I think we have this idea in America, and I think it was Martin Luther King who said, this arc of history bends toward justice. Like, we have this idea of, like, this history being linear or something, but, like, that has not been borne out in Jewish history. A lot of times people will say, like, oh, there's, we have all these, we have Jewish senators and we have Jewish Supreme Court justices, and we have, and I'm like, all of those things were also true in medieval Egypt. In medieval Egypt, all those things were also true in 10th century Spain. All of those things were also true in the Roman Empire. And you sort of have instead this sort of cyclical pattern in anti-Semitic. I mean, I think it was the one of the presidents of the Weimar Republic was Jewish. So, like, I mean, you have this sort of cyclical pattern instead, which is very bewildering and very disturbing. But I think, one of the, and I don't know that I have an answer to it, but I think that there's sort of, I think that there's a lack of curiosity about living Jews. And I do think that that's part of the problem. When I say a lack of curiosity, I mean just, a real veneration of dead Jews who are this metaphor instead of a celebration of living Jews.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. Oren says that I don't need to read this out loud, but I think this is a really good comment. He says, right, so we learned from all this that the evidence of hate is not necessarily ennobling. The Holocaust doesn't teach itself, which I think goes hand in hand with what you were saying as well.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, like, I'm not saying, like, we shouldn't teach people about the Holocaust. Like, that's not,
No.
like, to be clear, I mean, sort of,
Yes.
I think that there isn't, I don't think that is a vaccine against anti-Semitism, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. I think that,
Yeah.
and the most interesting example, a counterexample of this is a story that happened, I believe, in Florida, where there was a young man, there was about 5 years ago, or 4 or 5 years ago, there was a young man who was like the head of one of these, like, his father was the head of some, like, white supremacist organization, and he was a college student in Florida, but he had been involved in this sort of, like, whole white supremacist movement. And at whatever college he was at, and I'm not going to mess up the name of his college because you'll know where it is and I won't, at whatever college he was in, there were some Jewish students on this campus who, like, everybody knew who this guy was, and they thought, like, oh, we should befriend this guy, and they, like, invited him over to a Shabbat dinner, like a Sabbath dinner. And, like, they just kept inviting him, and he kept coming. And I want to get his name right. I think his name is Derek Black. He's written a book about this now. And so he basically, like, was sort of cured of his, anti-Semitism in a sense by engaging with living Jews and living Jewish culture. And, and befriending real people, actual people who are alive and are not a metaphor. And I thought, like, sort of that, and, who knows if that's scalable or if that was just a certain thing that happened to this one person. But, to me, that was a very, very powerful and inspiring story in a way that Anne Frank's story, not so inspiring since she was murdered.
Yeah, no, you drew similarities to kind of like the Black community as well earlier. And like Martin Luther King, but that reminds me, I'm forgetting this man's name because he's huge. He's a really important figure in the when it comes to like what you were just talking about. He did something similar where he would go. It's a Black man that would befriend Ku Klux Klan members and just like just hang out with them, and then he would start converting them out of the Ku Klux Klan just by becoming their friends. Just by speaking with them and inviting them over to like cookouts and stuff. So it's very interesting. The aspect of human connection and what it can do.
I mean, especially if you could do that with but if you could do that with Klan people, imagine how much easier it would be to do it with people who were not, already
exactly
like hate-filled agenda, right? I mean, it maybe would be easier.
Exactly.
I mean,
well, if you're ever down in Miami,
there's hope in that, which I will take that.
But Dara, if you're ever down in Miami, we would all love to continue this conversation, and we could invite Oren. Oren is a huge part of WPHL as well. He's actually been helping us with some of our Refusnik related events that are wrapping up on Sunday, which if you're listening, come out this Sunday to the Jewish Museum of Florida for our last Refusniks event. But to wrap up everything, thank you again, Dara, for joining us today. And thank you everyone for watching. So just a quick reminder, make sure to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, all of that good stuff at FIUWPHL, and make sure to follow the Miami Book Fair as well at Miami Book Fair online on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all of that good stuff. And make sure to visit the actual book fair. So it's the 38th annual Miami Book Fair happening November 14th to the 21st. So next week, I think that is, next week. At the MDC Wolfsonian campus, downtown Miami. You can find out some more information and RSVP for any of the talks at miamibookfair.com, and keep an eye out for our newsletter that's going to go out tomorrow with some information for some free tickets, which is going to be really, really cool. Okay, and you can access any of the virtual conversations at miamibookfaironline.com. So Dara is just one of the many authors from around the world participating in the Miami Book Fair 2021, the nation's largest gathering of writers and readers of all ages. They are so looking forward to sharing their work, thoughts, and new ideas with everyone in person and online. So please visit, like I said, miamibookfair.com for more information. And join us next week. Next week, we have our last 2 Miami Book Fair coffee and conversation talks, and we're so excited to speak with these authors. So on Tuesday, we have editor Jeanette Delgado, and the book Home in Florida, Latinx Writers and Literature of Uprootedness, moderated by Michael Grafals and Annie Castro. And then on Thursday, we have author Teresa K. Miller and her new book, Borderline Fortune, moderated by Whitney Bauman. But thank you once again, Dara and Rebecca. It's been an absolute pleasure. And we could do this for forever. I really wish we could stay on for another 2 hours, but thank you so much. And everyone, go read People of Dead Jews, go buy it, investigate. It's a really, really great read.
And listen to the podcast, which I'm going to do.
Oh, yes. One more time. Go listen to Adventures with Dead Jews. One last reminder, wherever you listen to podcasts, if you want to hear more stories similar to what you read in the book and heard on this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Take care. Be well.
Have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.